While Molly, our daughter, was in the emergency room, Clayton Stanfield was accompanying Victoria Fox, who had returned to the country with her son. Years ago, Victoria had left pregnant, and now her son and my daughter suffer from the same blood disorder, requiring a close relative's bone marrow transplant. Clayton and both children were found to be compatible donors. In the dead of night, his mother asked him, "Of the two children, which one will you save?" Without hesitation, Clayton replied, "Bruce, of course. He's endured so much hardship with Victoria over the years." Heartbroken, I chose to divorce and took my daughter to Southampton. Later, Molly recovered, but I heard that Clayton Stanfield, the London tycoon, had turned the country upside down searching for his missing wife and daughter. When we met again by chance, he desperately begged us to return to him. I asked Molly, "Do you still want your father?" "Not anymore," my daughter shook her head firmly. "That's right, because I didn't want him either." Ding! Webnovel reminds you to click the subscribe button in the bottom right corner to read the complete novel. When the doctor handed me the test results, I turned the thin piece of paper over and over, still unable to believe my eyes. The weather had been cool lately, and Molly's cold had been recurring. The worst outcome I had anticipated was pneumonia. How could it be Mediterranean anemia? Dr. Gilbert tried to comfort me. "This is a relatively common inherited hemolytic anemia that can be cured. As long as there's a suitable bone marrow match from a close relative, we can proceed with hematopoietic stem cell transplantation." After a long pause, I finally found my voice. "And before the transplant? Long-term blood transfusions and iron chelation therapy will be needed. This can effectively control the condition, but ultimately, a bone marrow transplant will be necessary. We need to act quickly. When the disease manifests in young children, delays can't be afforded as it can impact both physical growth and cognitive development." As we left the consultation room, Molly, who had just finished treatment accompanied by a nurse, brightened up at the sight of me. "Mommy!" I forced a smile and reached out to her. "Molly, let's go home." "Okay, but where's Daddy? Didn't he say he'd come pick us up?" Clayton had dropped us off at the hospital before hurrying away, saying there was an urgent meeting at the company. "Shall we give him a call and see if he's finished work?" My daughter nodded in agreement. But the call was immediately disconnected, and subsequent attempts went straight to voicemail. This had never happened before. Clayton had always been there for me and our daughter, responding to our every need. What was going on? Coincidentally, Darren Snowden, Clayton's childhood friend, had just posted on WhatsApp. The caption read, "Look who's back, everyone." The location was tagged as Heathrow Airport. The comments section was bustling with activity. Edmund Buckley, "Oh, Miss Fox. Won't Clayton be thrilled?" Clifford Ainsworth, "What was the story with those two back then? They were so passionate for years, then suddenly went quiet." Someone even mentioned me. Although Victoria was Clayton's first love, he's a model husband now. Won't his wife be upset if you talk like this? I bit my lower lip and tapped to open a video clip. On the screen, a tall man was holding a little boy securely, his movements full of tenderness. Beside them, a woman leaned in, affectionately adjusting the child's hat. The scene was harmonious and warm, looking just like a family of three. Even without seeing his face, I recognized the man as Clayton. And that woman, her features and contours were strikingly similar to mine. Victoria Fox? This name, it seemed, had never been mentioned by Clayton before. I returned home with our daughter, feeling dazed. Perhaps not expecting us back so early, the two housekeepers were chatting while they worked. "Did you buy the seed base earlier? The young master just called to say Miss Fox is coming today." "It's her favorite," Elsie asked. "Yes, I did. I also got Arctic clams, salmon, and sweet shrimp, all her favorites. She used to eat here almost every day before. It's been 7 years since she went abroad. I've missed her after not seeing her for so long," Bobby replied while sorting vegetables. Both of them had come from the old family house and knew Clayton's past best. So Victoria Fox was his childhood sweetheart, who had grown up with him. I coughed twice. Elsie and Bobby heard it, exchanged a glance, and immediately fell silent. Bobby, being quick-witted, approached with an awkward smile and asked concernedly, "Madam, you're back? Is Miss Molly all right? What did the doctor say?" I forced a smile and replied, "It's nothing serious. You two carry on, I'll take her to rest for a bit." I coaxed Molly to sleep. Her health had been poor lately. She wasn't sleeping well and had lost her appetite. It's normal for children to get bumps and bruises, but the bruises on her body took many days to fade. It turns out there were early signs of her anemia. I, as her mother, had been too careless. I felt a wave of guilt. After some time, the door opened and there was a commotion outside. "Wow, Uncle, is this your house? It's so cool! There's even a seesaw. If only I had someone to play with." The little boy's voice was shrill and chattery. "Wait a moment, Bruce. I'll call my daughter to play with you." Clayton's voice grew closer, followed by the door opening. "Molly, come out and play." My daughter, who had just fallen into a deep sleep, stirred at his disturbance. I quickly patted her gently, and with a stern face, asked in a low voice, "You left us at the hospital. Aren't you going to ask how we got back?" Clayton rubbed his nose, knowing he was in the wrong, and explained softly, "The company was busy, you know that." Intending to expose him, I opened WhatsApp again, only to find that Darren's post was no longer visible to me. Clayton leaned in, nuzzling me gently, his voice full of coaxing. "Darling, don't sleep now. We have guests. Come and bring Molly out to meet them, She's not feeling well and needs rest," I said coldly. "You can entertain them yourself." Clayton's expression darkened. Though he usually maintained a gentle demeanor, having grown up privileged, he couldn't tolerate being given the cold shoulder repeatedly. Ignoring me, he went straight to the bed and forcibly picked up our daughter. Not wanting her to be hurt, I had to let go. Molly, still groggy from sleep, opened her eyes to see Clayton and softly called out, "Daddy." She even affectionately nuzzled his face. "Molly, will you play with the big brother?" Clayton said, pressing his face against hers. "Okay." Worried, I could only get up and follow them out. The seesaw in the playroom was specially made for Molly by Clayton. Before, Clayton would sit on one end, while Molly and I sat on the other. Now it was Clayton holding Molly and Victoria holding Bruce. And I, like an out-of-place nanny, stood silently to the side. The little boy loved the excitement, screaming with joy for it to go faster and higher. Clayton obliged, pushing hard against the ground, his attention fully on Victoria and her son opposite him. Completely unaware that Molly's face had turned pale from the jostling. I stepped forward to stop them. Though Clayton was displeased, he did stop. However, as we crossed paths, he lowered his voice and said, "Celia, please don't be such a killjoy." They took the two children to play with toys again. It was Bruce's first time back in the UK, and everything seemed new to him. "Uncle, I want this go-kart," Bruce exclaimed. Clayton generously said, "Okay. And this kitchen playset, and the train tracks." "I want them all." "All right, they're all for Bruce," Clayton said in an indulgent tone. Molly pouted, "Dad, those are mine." It wasn't that she was being selfish. I had always taught her to ask permission before using others' belongings and to be polite. I also taught her that if other children liked something of hers and she was willing to share, her father and I would doubly compensate her for being generous. Still in her sensitive period for order, she was merely concerned that Bruce hadn't asked her first. But Clayton, unable to bear seeing Bruce's disappointed look, retorted without hesitation, "Molly, your brother isn't well. You need to let him have his way." Our daughter opened her mouth to say something more, but just then Elsie announced that dinner was ready. I went over and picked Molly up, quietly comforting her. "Be good, darling. Mummy will buy you even better toys." The dining table was laden with Victoria's favorite seafood and fresh produce. However, the doctor had warned that anemia patients can easily develop iron overload after treatment, and should avoid clams and prawns as much as possible. I asked Elsie to prepare some extra porridge and steamed egg for Molly. Victoria finally addressed me. "Celia, perhaps you've misunderstood Clayton and me. We're just friends. If you feel we're in the way here, we can leave. There's no need for you to make a fuss over the food. Molly's been playing all afternoon and must be hungry. Don't torment her like this. Even without this illness, Molly has never liked seafood. Like me, she finds it too fishy. I responded calmly. It's not that. Molly hasn't been feeling well these past couple of days and can't eat these things. Clayton put down his chopsticks. It's just a cold, isn't it? No need to be so careful. Bruce has such a serious illness, yet he still eats and drinks normally. I could no longer contain my anger. Covering my daughter's ears, I retorted loudly. Molly is ill too. She has Mediterranean anemia. Have you asked about her condition even once since we got the test results today? Clayton's expression froze, a hint of guilt flashing in his eyes. Victoria's expression turned sly as she said to Clayton, "What a coincidence. How come she has the same illness as Bruce? Looks like Celia is quite well informed." The implication was that I had already found out about Bruce's condition, and stupidly fabricated an excuse about Molly being ill. Hearing this, the guilt in Clayton's eyes was replaced by suspicion. He couldn't help but question me. "Celia, have you been following me? Since when did you learn to lie and make unreasonable scenes?" A wave of helplessness washed over me. I took out the test report from my bag and slammed it on the table. When Clayton saw the diagnosis, his face paled. He quickly took Molly into his arms. "Sweetheart, Daddy is so sorry." Molly stroked his chin to show her forgiveness. I closed my eyes briefly, then said dejectedly, "The doctor said my bone marrow isn't a match. You should go to the hospital as soon as possible." Victoria hastily added, "Yes, and do a compatibility test for Bruce while you're at it." 4. Bruce? The words echoed in my mind for a long time before I finally grasped their meaning. When I spoke, my voice was incredibly hoarse. "He is your child?" Clayton didn't dare meet my eyes. He lowered his head and mumbled an affirmative. "That all happened before I met you. Besides, I only found out recently." He tried to embrace me, but I stepped aside to avoid him. Victoria was still trying to comfort me. "Bruce was an accident back then. Now he's just a bond of friendship between Clayton and me." I had made up my mind not to return to the UK. If I hadn't failed the compatibility test myself, I wouldn't have come to find him. Using a child as a bond of friendship? How absurd. I first met Clayton Stanfield 5 years ago. At that time, he had just emerged victorious in a battle for inheritance rights against his illegitimate half-brother, becoming the youngest leader of the Stanfield family, full of vigor and ambition. As for me, I was just an orphan girl who grew up in a care home, without any family or support. After graduating from the University of York, I started working at Stanfield Group. Through chance encounters, Clayton began pursuing me passionately. Daily flowers, luxury handbags, and precious jewelry became commonplace. Escaping his busy work schedule for island getaways, custom fireworks displays on anniversaries, intimate moments in private estates. What was truly rare was his willingness to spend time and effort on me. A 6-month business trip to France and tens of thousands of miles of back-and-forth travel were proof of his love for me. At the time, I couldn't understand how an orphan girl with no background or connections could catch the eye of such a golden boy. After much thought, I naively believed it was what they call love at first sight. Today, I discovered that behind this supposed love at first sight, there was another reason. What he truly cared about was nothing more than my face, which somewhat resembled Victoria Fox's. The truth felt like a heavy shackle, firmly binding someone already drowning in misery. I was filled with anger and pain, wanting to question and complain, but not knowing to whom I could vent. For a moment, I even considered steeling myself to leave. But he held on to hope for Molly's recovery, and I shouldn't push him away at this moment. Clayton had settled Victoria and her son elsewhere. It was late at night when he finally hurried home. This time, I didn't leave the lights on for him as usual. My mind preoccupied, I pretended to be asleep with my back to the door. The bed sank behind me, and his familiar cedar scent enveloped me. He buried his face in the crook of my neck and promised in a muffled voice, "Darling, Don't worry, I'll protect Molly. If it weren't for the faint trace of Victoria's Gabrielle perfume clinging to him, I might have believed him. The next day, Clayton went for bone marrow typing. The private hospital was extremely efficient. That evening, I overheard Clayton on the phone and asked about the progress. He lowered his eyes slightly and after a long pause said, "No, the results aren't out yet." I felt somewhat disappointed, but tried to convince myself that being anxious now would be futile. That night, Molly developed another high fever, and I realized Clayton hadn't returned to our room. I went looking for him and found the study light on. My mother-in-law, who rarely visited, was unexpectedly present. If Dr. Poole hadn't called me, I wouldn't have known such a big thing had happened. Now you and both children are compatible donors, but only one stem cell collection can be done in the short term. The next one would have to wait at least a year. Do you want to save your son or your daughter first? Clayton didn't hesitate for a second. Bruce, of course. He's suffered a lot with Victoria over the years. My mother-in-law didn't say much more, just took out a black card. There's not much I can do. Give this to Victoria, consider it a small gesture from a grandmother. I stood frozen in place, a chill creeping up from the floorboards beneath my feet, spreading straight to my heart. The thermometer in my hand clattered to the ground. The conversation inside the room abruptly ceased as Clayton finally noticed my presence. A flicker of panic flashed in his eyes. My mother-in-law, however, remained composed. She glanced at me briefly before leaving nonchalantly, as if nothing had happened. Clayton hurriedly approached me, grasping my cold hands as he explained softly. "Celia, it's not that I don't love Molly. It's just that Bruce fell ill earlier and his condition is more severe. Molly still has time. Besides, Bruce is a boy after all, and you know how desperately my mother wants a grandson." When Molly was born, my already disapproving mother-in-law grew even colder towards me. During my postpartum confinement, she constantly found fault, hinting that I should get pregnant again immediately and keep trying until I bore a son. In a family of this standing, which daughter-in-law doesn't have several children? Yet you, with no parents, are so delicate. Clayton had smashed a cup arguing with her and even threatened to get a vasectomy. Back then, he was the one who stood up for me, insisting that a daughter could inherit the family business just as well. He was the one who, not wanting us to suffer any mistreatment, defied the pressure from the family elders and moved me and Molly out of the family home against everyone's wishes. But now, he was putting me behind others, asking me to wait. Clayton held me tightly in his arms. "Darling, I promise I'll work hard to get back in shape. In less than a year, just 6 months, I'll be ready to donate bone marrow to Molly. Please trust me, all right?" My heart shattered. Facing this foregone conclusion, all struggles seemed futile. Even if you could manage it, would your mother allow it? What if after 6 months your health still isn't up to par? What if Molly's condition worsens in the meantime? What if she grows up and learns that her father chose to save another child first? Have you considered all of this? He continued to argue. "I have, truly. I'll arrange the best medical team for her. As for the truth, if neither of us says anything, she'll never know. Besides, Bruce isn't just anyone, he's Molly's blood-related brother. Hasn't Molly always been asking for a big brother?" In the past, when Molly made such requests, I would laugh at her innocence. Clayton would use it as an excuse to be intimate with me night after night. Now that her childish wish had been absurdly granted, it turned out I was the fool who had been kept in the dark all along. Lowering my eyelashes, I let out a long sigh. After all your explanations, it really comes down to one thing. Bruce is Victoria's child, and Molly isn't, right? Molly's greatest sin was being born to me. And no matter how similar I am to Victoria, I'm still just a substitute. The genuine article, complete with a bonus, was back on the shelf. Naturally, the counterfeit had to make way. "Enough! Stop talking," he suddenly roared, his eyes bloodshot. "When will you ever learn to be sensible? Everything has its proper order. Celia, don't push me. I have no choice." Yes, Victoria came first, and so did Bruce. Molly and I came later, we were the replacements, the reluctant second choices. But now, we were the wife and child he lived with day and night. Before discussing who came first, shouldn't we consider who was closer, more urgent? Overwhelmed by exhaustion and sorrow, I choked up, unable to voice my grievances. Clayton yanked at his tie in frustration, then stood up and grasped the door handle, pulling it open forcefully. He stormed out without looking back. A child's cry came from behind. I didn't know how long Molly had been standing outside the room, or how much of that hurtful conversation she had overheard. She was clearly startled, her eyes reddening as tears welled up, but she bravely held them back. Her small, feverish hand gently touched my face. "Mummy, don't be scared." I pressed my cheek against her soft little face, my heart melting. As long as Molly is safe and sound, Mummy isn't afraid of anything. After a sleepless night of constant struggle, my daughter's high fever continued to fluctuate, showing no signs of abating. I took her to the hospital alone. She lay there with an 4-drip, a cooling patch on her forehead. Despite her illness, she didn't cry or fuss, quietly watching cartoons instead. Suddenly, there was a commotion behind the curtain next to us. "Uncle Clayton, I feel awful. Will you stay with me today?" It was Bruce. Clayton replied gently, "Of course I will." "Then tell me some stories." Clayton told one story after another, all ones he used to tell Molly. She seemed to realize something, glancing at me tearfully, but ultimately said nothing and drifted off to sleep under the influence of the medication. Having finally settled Bruce down, Victoria's soft voice could be heard. "Clayton, look how much he resembles you. I've regretted my decision every moment these past years. If only I hadn't left back then. Could we have been a happy family of 3? A moment of silence followed. Just as I thought Clayton wouldn't respond, he slowly spoke. "Victoria, what's past is past. Now my heart belongs only to Celia and Molly. Once Bruce recovers, you should return to the United States. Why are you being so cruel to me?" Victoria sobbed, her voice full of sorrow. "You don't know how happy I was when I found out I was pregnant. I swore then I'd raise him well." There was a rustling of fabric as she leaned into Clayton's embrace, continuing to cry. "When I gave birth to Bruce, I was all alone. The delivery room was so big, so cold. Thoughts of you were all that got me through that ordeal. You don't know how much I envy Celia. She had you by her side, while I had nothing." The shadows on the curtain merged as Clayton held Victoria tight. After a long while, he sighed. "I'm sorry. I'll make it up to you and Bruce from now on." I opened WhatsApp to find dozens of unread messages in my pinned chat, sent continuously from the early hours until just now. "Darling, I'm sorry. I lost my temper earlier. I'll stay at the office for a few days so we can both cool off. I've sent the driver with breakfast your favorite crab roe soup dumplings. Is Molly up yet? Can you video call me when she wakes? I love you. Please believe in me. Off to a meeting now. Working hard to provide for my wife and Molly. Passed by the hospital and inquired about Molly's treatment plan. Darling, are you not awake yet? Keep your spirits up, we'll beat this illness together." So men truly can be such hypocrites. He made all these superficial gestures, yet couldn't be bothered to ask our housekeeper if I was even home or how Molly was doing. I gently pressed the corner of my eye, unpinned our chat, and put it on mute. Just then, a message from my sister-in-law Alma popped up. "Celia, I heard about Molly. Are you all right? My brother is being so thoughtless, not discussing such a big matter with the family. I'm really worried about you." This was followed by a transfer of £5 million. "Celia, please take this money. I don't know much about medical treatments, but it's my savings. Use it for Molly's emergencies if needed." This was the only genuine comfort I'd felt in days. When I married into the Stanfield family, Alma was still young. Her mother and brother neglected her, so I was the one who cared for her most. That's why she's especially close to Molly and me. But she's still just a high school student. Such a heavy burden shouldn't fall on her shoulders. I tried to reassure her and sent the money back. But she insisted on not accepting it, saying it was her duty as an aunt. Fever reduction, blood transfusion, iron chelation therapy. Molly and I spent the entire day at the hospital. When we got home, Clayton was sitting on the living room sofa, his face grim. I didn't know how long he had been waiting. "Where have you been all day? You didn't reply to a single message." I retorted, "What about you? Where have you been since last night? Where else could I go besides the office? I've reported my schedule, haven't I? As for you, you're not considering Molly's health, dragging her around everywhere. Can you even be a proper mother?" My gaze slowly scanned Clayton's features. I didn't know when the person I shared a bed with, whom I saw day and night, had become so unfamiliar. It sent chills down my spine. In moments I hadn't noticed, how many more lies had he told me? Taking a deep breath, I spoke calmly. "Clayton, let's get a divorce. Give me a sum of money, and I'll take Molly with me." His eyes froze. He violently stubbed out his half-smoked cigar and sneered. "Celia, how long are you going to keep this up? Never mind anything else, I have the stem cells that can save Molly's life. Just based on that, can you bear to leave me?" How ridiculous. He wasn't willing to use the life-saving treatment for Molly first, yet he asked if I could bear to leave him. Ignoring his sarcasm, I continued. "Dr. Gilbert said that while transplants from close relatives have better outcomes, it's not an absolute requirement. As long as I have money, I can use someone else's." Seeing my resolute attitude, his tone softened, with a hint of helplessness and probing. "I just wanted to know where you went today, what you did, why you kept ignoring me. Surely it doesn't have to come to divorce?" "It does." Without any hesitation, I coldly uttered these words. "So all my words were for nothing, you still don't believe me? Fine, since you don't care about our daughter's life, I won't force the issue." He bit his cheek, feigning nonchalance. "How much do you want?" "Not much, 100 million pounds. It's a drop in the ocean for you." I took out a thin divorce agreement and pushed it in front of him. "Sign it now, and we'll go to the court tomorrow." Clayton stared intently at my face, as if trying to find a flaw in my expression. I met his gaze without flinching. After a long while, he nodded fiercely. "Fine, I'll sign. Celia, don't regret this." The divorce process was simpler than I had imagined. Clayton cared about his image and wouldn't back out during the cooling-off period. After returning from the registry office, I took off my wedding ring and put it in a box. The massive chamois solitaire still sparkled brilliantly, but the love and vows it once represented had soured. At our wedding, the priest had asked, "Mr. Stanfield, will you love this woman forever, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer?" Thinking back now, Clayton's gaze at that moment seemed to look through me, falling on someone else. Perhaps that firm "I do" was never meant for me. When it came to being spiteful, Clayton always had to have the upper hand. Seeing me like this, he also took off his wedding ring and carelessly tossed it aside. He then gave a high-profile interview, blurting out, "I'm single now, very free." When the host inquired about his relationship status, in an instant, I became the laughingstock of our social circle. The more intense people's envy had been when Clayton and I got married, the more scorching their mocking gazes were now. But I didn't care. The person I loved most was battling a serious illness. I had no energy left to deal with idle gossip. In the month that followed, I spent every day with Molly, taking her for hospital checkups, to amusement parks, and to taste various delicacies. Clayton, on the other hand, was no longer busy. He idled at home every day, even having his secretary come to the house to report on work matters. Victoria Fox came over a few times, but each time he took her and Bruce to the old family house. However, he always returned home in the evening. I moved with Molly to the guest room, out of sight, out of mind. In my spare time, I arranged for a house in Southampton in advance. Dr. Gilbert told me that the city had access to global medical resources and might offer more hope for Molly's condition. It was worth a try. I asked Molly, "Sweetheart, would you like Mummy to take you to a beautiful city?" My daughter answered in her sweet voice, "Yes. I'll go anywhere with Mummy. What if we don't take Daddy with us? Would that be okay?" My daughter counted on her chubby fingers, thinking hard for quite a while. Daddy wanted to be a daddy for other children first. He put me behind others, so I should put him behind too. I gently stroked her hair, feeling a pang of bitterness in my heart. Such a simple truth, how had I not seen it clearly before? As soon as the divorce papers were in my hands, I booked a flight for that very day. Packing up the few belongings I had, I took Molly's small hand in mine, and resolutely left the house that had been my home for 5 years. Just as we were about to leave, Clayton blocked the doorway, his eyes red-rimmed and bloodshot. "Celia, if I had chosen to give the transplant to Molly first, would we have avoided ending up here today?" he asked, as if such a hypothetical scenario would be some great blessing for us both. My expression remained calm as I simply asked him to step aside, without acknowledging his question. He moved slightly, turning his head away as he spoke in an unnatural tone. "You don't have to move out. This house is yours to keep." I shook my head, responding quietly, "That won't be necessary." While exchanging my boarding pass, I caught a glimpse of an old photo in my wallet. It showed Celia and Clayton from 5 years ago, smiling brightly. No matter how many wallets I'd gone through over the years, I'd always kept that photo with me. I held it, looking at it twice more before walking down the jet bridge, and casually tearing it to pieces, dropping them in a rubbish bin. From this moment on, the past was forgotten, wiped clean. As the plane broke through layers of clouds to reveal a clear blue sky, a surge of hope welled up inside me. I prayed that this same liberating force would descend upon Molly as well. May she push through the fog and see the light. Perhaps once a person shakes off the shadows of the past, good fortune follows close behind. It had been barely 2 months since Molly and I arrived in Southampton, when the doctor informed us of preliminary results from the low-resolution human leukocyte antigen typing. A few days later, a nurse called with good news. "Ms. Stewart, congratulations. We've found a suitable donor match. We'll be arranging the hospital admission soon, so please make sure you're prepared," she said cheerfully. I wept with joy. Hanging up, I noticed several missed calls from Clayton, which hadn't connected due to the line being busy. He had also sent text messages. "Celia, I'm drunk. Can you come get me? I miss you so much, and Molly too. How is she doing?" Just the other day, Alma had called to chat, and at the end of the conversation, she quietly revealed that Clayton had already donated hematopoietic stem cells for Bruce. However, Bruce was experiencing severe rejection symptoms. Alma was very worried about her little niece and repeatedly cautioned me. "Bruce has developed acute graft-versus-host disease. He's covered in rashes and blisters, suffering from abdominal pain and vomiting. His serum bilirubin levels are frighteningly high. He's still in the ICU at the hospital, poor thing. Celia, you must keep a close eye on Molly's condition. If anything seems off, intervene early." This was precisely when Victoria and Bruce needed Clayton most, yet here he was, finding time to go drinking. I blocked his number and set my phone aside, no longer bothered by it as I focused on preparing everything for Molly. Outside the operating theater, fear engulfed me like a tidal wave. Molly was my only blood connection in this world. And now she lay unconscious on the operating table, her future uncertain. I couldn't sit still, silently praying to every deity I could think of. A friend alerted me that Clayton had updated his usually quiet social media profile. I opened the screenshot to see a single line of text. "Is there a time machine that can take us back to the past?" The accompanying image showed our old wedding rings, with his still firmly on his left ring finger. Such pointless nostalgia did nothing to alleviate the suffering Molly and I had endured. I set my phone down quietly and picked up the 18 prayer beads I had gotten from Hum Hum Temple. Once again praying fervently. This devoted woman is willing to exchange her ex-husband's 20 years of good fortune for her daughter's lifelong health and peace. Perhaps the gods heard my plea, for fortunately, the transplant surgery went very smoothly. The post-operative immunosuppressants were administered appropriately, with adjustments made for Molly's specific condition. Her rejection symptoms were very mild. Her once pale and thin face, weakened by anemia, visibly gained color and fullness. I sent a message to Alma expressing my gratitude for her warnings. Amidst her joy, she shared some gossip with an air of mystery. A while back, my brother caused quite a scene at Royal Kensington Hospital, and even cut off Bruce's treatment funds. It turned out that Bruce's post-operative complications were quite severe, requiring blood transfusions. Clayton happened to see Bruce's blood test results, which showed he was type O. But Clayton himself was type AB, making it impossible for him to father a child with type O blood. Clayton suddenly realized that Bruce wasn't his biological son at all. But how could this be, when they looked so alike and their bone marrow was a match? Under intense questioning, Victoria finally confessed that Clayton's half-brother, Linus, was Bruce's real father. Years ago, Linus had lost the battle for inheritance rights and left for overseas, heartbroken. He passed away not long after. When Bruce fell ill, Victoria had no choice but to turn to Clayton and try her luck. Alma sent me a video she had secretly recorded. In the footage, Clayton's eyes were red and bloodshot as he demanded, "Why did you do this to me?" Victoria's hair was disheveled, a far cry from her once gentle demeanor. She shouted back, nearly hysterical, "Clayton Stanfield, this is all your karma. If you hadn't driven Linus to his death back then, how could he have abandoned us?" She paused, a flash of satisfaction in her eyes, before continuing viciously. "I could have found an unrelated donor. But I wanted you to know what it feels like to give your heart and soul for your enemy's son. How does it feel to be betrayed by everyone? Does it hurt?" Clayton clenched his fists and left the room without a word. The image shook, and the video abruptly ended. Finally, Alma spoke softly, with a hint of caution in her voice. "My brother's been going mad trying to find you. He even came to ask me if I knew where you and Molly had gone. Celia, do you think we could ever be a family again, like before? I miss you and Molly so much. If my brother has truly realized his mistakes, once you've calmed down, and he's been punished enough, won't you come back? Please?" I smiled, not knowing what more to say. She was still young, her heart untouched by love. She didn't yet understand the complexities of loving and being loved. Nor did she realize that once time has passed and circumstances have changed, some things can never return to the way they were before. Later, I heard more sporadic news about Clayton Stanfield. It wasn't that I deliberately sought information. His background was simply too dazzling, with every move attracting attention. I heard he used all his political and business connections to search for his missing wife and daughter. He shouldered the pressure from the board of directors, disregarding any damage to the brand's reputation, and renamed all the hotels under the Stanfield Group to Stewart Hotels. At the same time, he established the Mediterranean Anemia Children's Medical Foundation to help families who couldn't find suitable donors alleviate their financial burdens. Perhaps he thought I was still taking Molly around for medical treatment. He placed missing person advertisements in all major hospitals across the country, playing 24/7. £5 million reward for finding beloved wife Celia Stewart. But all of this was in vain. Across the English Channel, Molly and I lived a comfortable life, growing increasingly distant from Clayton's world. Although we could live worry-free with the divorce settlement, one still needs to be self-reliant. To make it easier to care for Molly, I opened a flower shop. I only sold my beloved camellias. After Molly recovered, I became extremely indulgent with her, and she gradually grew bolder and more mischievous. One day, she knocked over the flower rack, and dozens of pots crashed to the ground. Knowing I couldn't bear to scold her, she sat on the floor pretending to cry while secretly observing my reaction. I steeled my heart, picked her up, and made her clean up the mess. When you do something wrong, you can't escape responsibility by throwing a tantrum. You need to find a way to make amends yourself. Molly listened and obediently did as she was told. The wind chime at the door tinkled, signaling a customer's arrival. I looked up to see a tall figure, strangely familiar yet unfamiliar, with a slightly hoarse voice. "A bouquet of white camellias, please." My wife's favorite. Clayton walked in casually, then froze the moment he saw Molly cleaning up. Molly, focused on her task, didn't look up and called out to me in fluent Southampton accent. "Mummy, there's a mister here to buy flowers." He turned to look at me, and the documents in his hands scattered across the floor. "Celia." His eyes instantly reddened. "I thought I'd never see you and Molly again. Children are quick to forget." Seeing Clayton's strange expression, Molly asked me, "This mister is acting weird, Mummy. Do you know him? He's an old acquaintance of Mummy's. I patted her head. There are freshly baked pineapple buns in the kitchen. Go have some. Hearing this, Molly ran off happily. Watching our daughter's retreating figure, Clayton's eyes were full of disbelief. It shouldn't be like this, he shook his head, biting his cheek. Molly is my daughter. She should have grown up in London, speaking with a posh accent, drinking tea, and walking dogs in Hyde Park. She shouldn't be like this now. As he spoke, he reached out to me. Celia, will you come back with me? I know I was wrong, and I'm trying my best to make amends. His words were laughable. In his eyes, it seemed that as long as he turned back and admitted his mistakes, I would love him again without any reservations. He then enumerated in detail all the so-called things he had done for Molly and me. Make amends? How have Molly and I benefited from anything you've done? I asked. Clayton was stunned, explaining futilely. I just wanted you to know how much I care about you. Look, I remember you like camellias. Every time I think of you and Molly, I personally buy a bouquet. I'm so glad I remembered, otherwise I wouldn't have met you today. I interrupted him. Clayton Stanfield, you only know I like camellias, but do you know what they symbolize? His eyes revealed his bewilderment. They symbolize how dare you underestimate my love. Camellias are delicate and tender, yet they have their own pride. When their blooming period ends, they don't wilt petal by petal, but fall off as whole flowers. Camellias are known as beheaded flowers, never clinging to the branch. So, put away your self-proclaimed romantic gestures and stay away from my daughter and me. After closing the flower shop, I drove Molly home. She fastened her seatbelt and suddenly looked at me, her big eyes blinking. Mom, I remember now. That man this afternoon was Dad, wasn't he? I nodded and asked, that's right. Do you still want him? No. She shook her head firmly. Her words carried far on the wind. Glimpsing the dejected figure beside the black Maybach in the rearview mirror, I smiled. From that day on, my little shop received a valuable order every day that didn't require delivery. And Molly would always see Clayton at the school gates. I asked if she found it annoying. He's like a stranger, she shook her head. Not even as familiar as the security guard at school. On Valentine's Day, the flower shop was especially busy, and we closed late at night. As I was preparing to go home, spectacular fireworks suddenly burst over Southampton Water. I looked up to see the dazzling display, each burst fading instantly as the next bloomed. Such permits are hard to obtain. I wondered who had the influence and dedication to arrange this. Just then, I received a text from an unknown number. Celia, today is our 8th wedding anniversary. This is my surprise for you. Do you like it? I'm in hospital. The other day I saw a girl nearly hit by falling debris. It reminded me of Molly, so I rushed to push her out of the way. Could you bring our daughter to see me? I did take Molly to the hospital, but not because of Clayton Stanfield. It was my new boyfriend. He had too much to drink at a work event and was sent by colleagues for an IV drip. The gastroenterology and orthopedic departments were on opposite sides of the corridor. As the lift arrived, Clayton was already waiting, having somehow gotten wind of our visit. His leg was in a cast, his tall frame propped up on crutches, looking rather disheveled. But his eyes held an irrepressible smile. Celia, I knew you still cared. Edwin, I called out to the tall, handsome man behind him. Molly ran towards him too. Clayton's words were cut off by my actions, his expression instantly freezing as the hope in his eyes vanished. I walked past him towards the opposite direction. He tried to stop me, but I turned my face slightly. Clayton, please don't be such a killjoy. Perhaps remembering something, his face suddenly paled. He then numbly let go, allowing me to leave. His gaze bored into my back, a tangle of desolation and regret, as if it would burn a hole. But it was he who taught me in the most painful way that when forced to choose. There's no weighing of pros and cons, no we'll see. There's only important and unimportant, willing and unwilling. Later, Clayton's mother couldn't stand her son's antics anymore. She chartered a plane to Southampton and forcibly took him away. The day the private jet departed, my bank account received a huge deposit, with so many zeros it made my eyes swim. By rough estimate, it was about half of Clayton's fortune, enough for Molly and me to live comfortably for generations. The transfer message was sickeningly sweet. "I'll always be here, if only you'd turn back." I thought about replying no need, but felt it unnecessary. My mind flashed back to my first date with Clayton. Fine dining, candlelight dinner. The fortune cookie on my plate happened to contain a prophecy. Love is a journey. Treat each other well. Back then I took it as a gift from fate, a sign of divine favor. Only now do I understand. Love is a journey, not a destination. Journeys have ups and downs, but ultimately everyone returns to their starting point. And those we meet along the way are like duckweed, gathering and scattering. Parting ways is the best ending. No need to dwell on it.